A faint hiss filled the humid jungle air as hundreds of paper cups passed from hand to trembling hand. Children cried softly while armed men stood watch. In the center, one voice echoed through loudspeakers, commanding devotion through death. This was not faith, this was Jonestown. This case is about a man who preached salvation but delivered death. It begins in the Midwest with a boy named Jim Jones growing up in rural Indiana during the Great Depression. He was a loner drawn to churches and sermons, fascinated by the fire and fear in religious voices. As he grew older, his obsession with power blended with progressive ideals, civil rights, racial integration, equality. He fed on these causes and used them to build a following. By the 1950s, Jim Jones had founded the People's Temple. He presented it as a sanctuary for the poor, the outcast, and the forgotten. Black families flocked to it. Addicts, the elderly, working-class mothers. Jones welcomed them all with open arms and a glowing promise of justice. But behind his dark glasses and soothing voice, something else was growing. A need to control, a hunger for obedience. He staged fake healings using planted actors. He exaggerated threats from the outside world. He warned his congregation that the government would hunt them if they ever left him. Eventually, fearing scrutiny in the United States, Jones moved his entire church thousands of miles away to the dense jungle of Guyana. There, the trees grew high and the rain fell hot. The compound was called Jonestown. From the air, it looked like paradise. On the ground, it was a fortress. Armed guards walked the perimeter. Loudspeakers played his voice at all hours. No one could leave. Survivors described the days as endless cycles of labor and indoctrination. The nights were worse. Rumors of abuse and coercion hung in the humid air. Food was rationed. Letters were censored. Families were watched. Trust was used like a weapon. Inside the compound, faith became fear. The man they once believed in now spoke of death as deliverance. And soon, that deliverance would come. Life inside Jonestown moved to the rhythm of Jim Jones' voice. From morning to night, his words echoed from loudspeakers nailed high on trees and buildings. He preached through the static with slurred intensity, mixing scripture with paranoia. The sun was hot, the air was thick, and the jungle pressed in from every side. It was no longer a refuge, it was a sealed world where time blurred and the outside felt like a dream. Jones had become more than a preacher. To many, he was a prophet. To others, he was a captor. The compound followed a strict routine. Wake up before dawn, report to your assigned labor group, work the fields, building clean, maintain the illusion of a thriving socialist utopia. But beneath the surface, fear moved like a current. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Children were separated from their parents. Letters home were rewritten or confiscated. Anyone who spoke of escape was labeled a traitor. The punishment could be public shaming or forced isolation. In some cases, witnesses described disturbing incidents behind closed doors, where certain individuals endured acts of coercion designed to break their will. In Jonestown, love and loyalty were measured by obedience. Doubt was treated as betrayal. Jones had grown increasingly erratic. His eyes looked sunken. His voice cracked under the weight of his own delusions. He claimed he was being targeted by the CIA. He warned of an imminent nuclear war. He told his followers that America was collapsing and that Jonestown was the last place on Earth where justice lived. He would often hold long, rambling meetings that stretched deep into the night. These gatherings were not discussions. They were psychological sieges. He called them white nights. During these sessions, Jones asked the crowd if they were willing to die for the cause. Sometimes, he would pass out cups of colored liquid and demand that everyone drink. Then, he would watch. Minutes later, he would reveal it was only a test, but the message was clear. Death was not a possibility, it was preparation. The strain was taking its toll. Some residents began to quietly beg visiting relatives for help. Others whispered plans of escape, knowing full well they were being monitored. Surveillance was constant. Jones had created a shadow government inside the commune. Informants were planted within families. Husbands turned on wives. Children reported on parents. It was a system built on distrust. Any attempt to leave had to be made in silence, without a sound, in the dead of night. through miles of jungle where danger waited at every turn. In the United States, families of People's Temple members had grown desperate. They formed coalitions. They wrote letters to Congress. They pleaded for help. The most persistent among them reached Congressman Leo Ryan. He listened. He agreed to go. When Ryan arrived in Guyana in November of 1978, accompanied by journalists and relatives of Temple members, the atmosphere was tense. Jones greeted them with staged smiles and rehearsed performances. Jonestown was scrubbed clean for their arrival. Children sang. Adults offered carefully chosen words of praise, but cracks appeared quickly. During a tour of the grounds, one Temple member slipped Ryan a note. It was scribbled quickly and begged for help. Others soon followed. The truth was leaking out. Ryan decided to escort the defectors out. Jones watched with growing panic. To him, this was the collapse of his vision. The outside world had pierced the veil. The next morning, as Ryan and the defectors made their way to a dirt airstrip at Port Kaituma, Jones gave the order. A truck filled with Temple gunmen followed them. At the airstrip, as the group boarded two small planes, the gunmen opened fire. Congressman Ryan was shot and killed. 3 journalists and a Temple defector died alongside him. Several others were wounded. Chaos exploded in seconds. Blood spilled across the dirt. The final act had begun. Back at Jonestown, the loudspeakers played again. Jones' voice was slow and deliberate. He told the community that enemies were coming, that they would torture their children, that they had only one honorable choice left. It was time, he said, for revolutionary suicide. Barrels of cyanide mixed with grape-flavored drink were brought into the pavilion. Large syringes without needles were used to squirt the mixture into the mouths of children. Adults followed. Some believed. Others cried. Armed guards watched the exits. Resistance meant a bullet. The air filled with screams, then silence, then more screams. The jungle held its breath. Inside 30 minutes, hundreds had collapsed. Mothers, fathers, infants, the elderly, friends holding hands. Bodies piled under the hot sun. Jim Jones was later found in a chair with a gunshot wound to the head. Whether self-inflicted or not has never been confirmed. By the time Guyanese authorities and American military officials arrived, the scene was incomprehensible. Rows of lifeless forms covered the earth. The heat was unbearable. The smell was overwhelming. Over 900 lives had ended in a single afternoon, all at the command of a man who once promised hope. The silence that followed would echo for generations. It began with a single voice through the loudspeakers, slow, measured, hollow. Jim Jones stood before his followers in the central pavilion of Jonestown. His face looked drained of life. His voice trembled with fatigue. He told them the airstrip killings had sealed their fate, that American forces were coming, that they would take their children, that there would be torture. He said their only escape now was death. Not just death, but an act of revolutionary loyalty. The crowd sat in silence. Mothers held babies close. Teenagers clutched the hands of the elderly. Some wept. Some looked dazed. The jungle was still. Then came the vats. Large metal containers filled with a purple mixture, flavor aid laced with potassium cyanide, diphenhydramine, chloral hydrate, and tranquilizers. Syringes without needles were handed out. Tables were arranged for the children first. They were taken to the front. Jones said they would go peacefully, that this was mercy. A nurse approached each child. One by one, the solution was poured into their mouths or squirted into their throats. Infants screamed. Toddlers choked. Some refused and were forcefully held. There was crying. There was confusion. There were no choices. Mothers rocked lifeless bodies in their arms. Some collapsed immediately after. Some stood frozen as the line moved forward. The poison worked quickly. Within minutes, children convulsed. Their muscles seized. Their breathing stopped. Some parents followed their children voluntarily. Others hesitated. Armed guards stood nearby, eyes sharp, fingers tight on triggers. In the chaos, a few tried to run. They were met with warnings. Others were caught and forced down. Some were injected. Others were coerced. Witnesses later described seeing entire families lying side by side, hands still linked, bodies shaking, then still. Jones remained seated in a folding chair near the center of the pavilion, a microphone in hand. His voice continued to drone as the crowd around him dissolved into death. He called it an act of dignity. He called it liberation. but his words were laced with panic. He could hear the screams, the groans, the gasps of people fighting to breathe. He told them not to be afraid, that this was not suicide, that this was a political statement. But by then, the air was filled with a sickly, sweet chemical stench. People collapsed on the ground. Some leaned into each other. Others lay curled in the fetal position, frothing at the mouth, eyes wide open. Outside the pavilion, bodies began to spill over. Some stumbled into the surrounding grass and died there. Others fell where they stood. The jungle floor became a mosaic of limbs and silence. The temperature climbed. The sun beat down. The soil soaked in everything. Inside the cabin where Jones once recorded sermons and speeches, his closest aides met their own end. Among them were nurses and loyalists. Many died beside each other, in rooms once filled with songs and slogans. Only stillness remained. Sometime later, a single gunshot cracked through the quiet. Jim Jones was found slumped in a chair with a wound to his head. A revolver rested beside him. No final words, no explanation, just silence. When Guyanese authorities arrived nearly a full day later, they were not prepared for what they saw. Rows of bodies stretched across the pavilion. They were stacked, twisted, overlapped. Men, women, children, infants, all collapsed where they fell. Many showed signs of foaming at the mouth, discolored skin, eyes half open. Some bodies were clutching others. Some still showed the outline of breathless struggle. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of decay and chemicals. The silence was deafening. There were no survivors inside the pavilion. A few managed to hide in the surrounding jungle during the chaos. Others had been away on errands and returned to devastation. One temple member, ordered to deliver a suitcase of funds to the Soviet embassy, later spoke of how he only realized the full scope when he returned to find the community wiped out. In total, 909 people had died. Nearly 300 were children. Most were American citizens. All of them had once believed they had found a home. The massacre at Jonestown was the deadliest non-natural loss of American civilian life until the events of September 11th. It was not a war. It was not an accident. It was a decision made by one man and carried out under a haze of fear and obedience. The footage taken after shows rows of bloated bodies under the brutal tropical sun. No movement, no sound, just the devastating aftermath of a promise that turned to poison. Jonestown had been called a utopia. In the end, it became a mass grave. When the bodies were finally cleared from Jonestown, the earth beneath them was bare and stained. The huts stood untouched for weeks. Beds remained unmade. Children's shoes still sat beside rusted wash basins. Photographs were found folded in pockets. Some showed smiling faces now frozen in time. Others were burned along the edges as if someone had tried to erase the past before it arrived. The few who survived spoke softly. Their voices cracked when describing the final moments. Some could not speak at all. Others refused to return to the United States, unable to explain what they had lived through. In interviews, there were long pauses, blank stares, a distant silence in the eyes of people who had once believed they were building something pure. In California, the former headquarters of the People's Temple was shuttered. Flyers still hung in nearby phone booths long after the deaths. Promises of healing, invitations to worship, faded words for a vanished congregation. No one took them down. No one walked too close. The jungle eventually grew over Jonestown. Vines crept along the abandoned buildings. Rain filled the empty spaces with soft, constant sound. Nature did not erase what happened. It only covered it. There is no monument, no statue, no single place to mourn. Just a field in Guyana where nearly 1,000 lives ended in absolute silence. And if you stand there long enough, the trees do not move. The air does not shift. The ground does not forget. Some who claimed to be loyal aides disappeared before the bodies were found. Others who handled finances left behind no trace. Suitcases of cash vanished across borders. Audio tapes recovered from the scene went silent mid-sentence. In official transcripts, key pages are missing. A shipment meant for the commune arrived days too late and was never opened. In survivor interviews, certain names are spoken once and never repeated. The list of dead was incomplete for weeks. Even now, several individuals remain unaccounted for. And deep in the Guyanese soil, beneath the overgrowth, lie items never cataloged and voices never heard again.